The cabin of United Airlines Flight 2247 is humming at 35,000 feet somewhere over the vast darkness of the American Midwest, and most of the 286 passengers on this Boeing 737-900 are doing what people do on a red-eye from Los Angeles to New York. Pulling eye masks down, wedging neck pillows into place, letting the engine roar lull them toward something resembling sleep. The galley lights are dimmed to that particular shade of amber that makes everything look like the inside of a whiskey glass. It is 11:47 p.m. The flight attendants have just finished their final drink service. For exactly 4 minutes, Flight 2247 is peaceful. Then the scream splits the cabin in half. "What do you think you're doing?" The voice belongs to the woman in seat 14B, center seat, middle of the main cabin, a location that will soon become the most notorious piece of real estate at 35,000 feet. She is standing. She is actually standing in the aisle, which is a violation of the fasten seatbelt sign that has been illuminated for the past 20 minutes due to light chop over Kansas. But no one in the immediate vicinity of row 14 is thinking about seatbelt signs right now, because the woman is holding something above her head with both hands like an offering to an angry god. It is a smartphone, and it is not her smartphone. "You were filming me?" she shrieks, her voice pitching upward in a register that causes a toddler 3 rows back to jolt awake and immediately begin crying. "You people think you can just record someone without their permission? That is illegal. That is a federal crime." The man she is screaming at is in seat 14A, the window seat. He has not stood up. He cannot easily stand up because his left leg is in a carbon fiber walking brace that extends from his ankle to just below his knee, and because the wheelchair that brought him from the jetway to the seat is currently stored in the forward cargo hold 30 feet below the cabin floor. He is in his early 50s, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of composed, watchful eyes that have spent decades reading people in high-pressure rooms. He is wearing a charcoal gray button-down and slacks. His carry-on bag, which is stowed in the overhead bin directly above him, contains a laptop, 3 legal briefs, a dog-eared copy of the federal aviation regulations, and a business card holder embossed with the seal of the Aviation Bar Association. His name is Marcus Delano Webb, and he is not panicking. "Ma'am," he says, and his voice carries a quality that is almost eerie in its steadiness. The voice of a man who has delivered closing arguments in packed federal courtrooms during turbulence far worse than this. "I'd ask you to please return my property." "Your property?" She is vibrating with something that looks like fury but has the particular quality of a performance, of someone who has practiced outrage so many times it has become instinct. "This is my flight. You don't get to record me on my flight." And then, before a single flight attendant can reach row 14, before the stunned passenger in 14C can process what is happening, before Marcus Webb can say another word, she brings the phone down, hard, against the metal edge of the tray table. The screen shatters with a sound like a single gunshot in the pressurized cabin. 300 passengers who were not already awake are now awake. Every head in the cabin is turning. 2 flight attendants freeze at the forward galley entrance, their training momentarily overwhelmed by the sheer audacity of what they just witnessed. The woman in 14B, her name, as the boarding records will show, is Diane Hartwell, age 51, resident of Scottsdale, Arizona, and holder of a United Airlines Mileage Plus account that is about to experience a very dramatic change in status. Stands over the broken phone with her chest heaving and her chin thrust forward like a general surveying a battlefield she has just won. She has not won anything. She has just made the worst mistake of her life at 35,000 feet with nowhere to land. But she doesn't know that yet. And what happens next, what unfolds over the following 2 hours and 17 minutes of Flight 2247, will change aviation passenger rights policy, end a career, and make Marcus Delano Webb's name known to every aviation attorney, airline executive, and frequent flyer in the country. Stay with this story, because it is about to get so much more complicated. To understand how Diane Hartwell ended up standing in the aisle of a Boeing 737 at midnight, destroying a stranger's property at altitude, you have to go back. Back to who she was before this flight, and back to who she had always been in every airport, on every plane, in every boarding line where she felt her comfort was the only comfort that mattered. Diane Hartwell was not born entitled. Entitlement, the particular species that flowers in adulthood, is usually cultivated, fed by small victories, by moments when throwing a big enough fit got you a better seat, an upgraded hotel room, a refund on a restaurant meal you had clearly eaten entirely before complaining about. Diane had discovered early in life that volume worked, that tears, when strategically deployed, unlocked things, that the phrase, "Do you know who I am?" even when the answer was nobody particularly interesting, made customer service representatives visibly uncomfortable enough to start making concessions just to make the feeling stop. She had worked in real estate in Scottsdale for 22 years. She was good at it, in the way that a certain kind of aggressive personality is good at anything that rewards relentless self-promotion. She drove a white Range Rover. She hosted a local podcast about luxury home staging with 4,000 listeners, which she described in every social situation as a major platform. She had 37 documented complaints with various airlines over the past 8 years. United, American, Delta, Southwest. Complaints about seat sizes, about the temperature of the cabin, about passengers near her who smelled, about flight attendants who she accused of being rude when they politely asked her to comply with standard safety procedures. She had been bumped from 2 airline loyalty programs. She did not see this as information about herself. Tonight, Diane Hartwell was flying home from a real estate conference in Los Angeles, where she had been a secondary speaker on a panel about luxury home staging trends. She had been expecting a first-class upgrade. The upgrade had not materialized. She had spent 45 minutes at the check-in counter explaining to a gate agent named Priya why this was unacceptable. Gate agent Priya, who had been working a 12-hour shift, had explained with remarkable composure that the flight was oversold in first class and that Diane's elite status did not currently qualify her for the upgrade pool. Diane had asked for a supervisor. The supervisor had said the same thing Priya said. Diane had filed a complaint on the United app while walking to the gate, her thumbs moving with the practiced fury of someone who has written many such complaints. She boarded in Group 3. She was in 14B, a center seat she had not selected, because she had been late booking and the window and aisle seats were gone. She settled in with the energy of someone who intended the entire cabin to know they were suffering. Marcus Webb was already in 14A when she sat down. He had boarded early, using the pre-boarding accommodation for passengers with mobility devices, and he had watched the cabin fill with the patient, observational quality of a man who has spent decades reading rooms. He had his legal briefs open on the tray table. He had his reading glasses perched on his nose. He had nodded pleasantly to Diane when she dropped into the center seat with an audible sigh designed to communicate suffering to the entire row. She had looked at his leg brace, then at the space his brace occupied near the seat pocket. And something had shifted in her expression, a calculation, the mental arithmetic of a person deciding whether someone else's disability was inconveniencing her. "Is that going to be a problem?" she said, not introducing herself, not saying hello, pointing at the brace. "The brace," Marcus said. "No, it stays out of your space entirely. I've flown with it many times." She had made a sound, not quite a word, more of a skeptical exhale, and proceeded to establish her dominance over the shared armrest with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this for years. The passenger in 14C, a young software developer named Kevin Park who was heading back to New York after visiting his parents, had caught Marcus's eye briefly. Marcus had given a small, almost imperceptible shrug. Kevin had looked back at his laptop screen. Both men were, in their different ways, already bracing for something. What neither of them anticipated was that Diane would wait until the lights were dimmed, until the cabin had settled into that false peace of a red-eye past its first hour, and then begin recording Marcus on her own phone. This was the extraordinary thing, the thing that would become the centerpiece of every legal brief and airline policy review that followed. Diane Hartwell, who had just screamed about being recorded without consent, had herself spent the previous 40 minutes recording Marcus Webb, apparently to document what she described to the flight attendant, when she was still calm enough to speak to a flight attendant, as this man taking up more than his fair share of the row due to his medical equipment. She had been building a complaint file on him. Marcus Webb, who had been a licensed FAA-certificated aviation attorney for 23 years, who had argued cases before the National Transportation Safety Board, who had written amicus briefs that shaped Air Carrier Access Act enforcement policy, who had personally trained airline crew members on disability rights law in 14 states, Marcus Webb had pulled out his phone and done what any trained legal professional does when they observe potential violations of 14 CFR Part 382. the Air Carrier Access Act. He had documented them. He was quiet about it. Methodical. He had captured Diane's comments to the flight attendant about his brace. He had captured the moment she had leaned deliberately into his space with her elbow in a way that dug into his right arm for a full 3 minutes. He had captured her ostentatious performance of suffering. The sighing, the eye rolls, the muttered commentary about people who shouldn't be in regular seating, that was pitched just low enough to claim deniability but just loud enough for both Kevin Park and the woman in 13A to hear clearly. Diane had noticed his phone, and something had fired in the engine of her outrage. The same engine that had been running for 8 years of airline complaints, the engine that told her she was always the victim, always the one being wronged, always the one entitled to escalation. She had grabbed the phone out of his hand mid-recording. She had screamed about federal crimes. She had smashed it against the tray table. And now, in the wreckage of row 14, on a Boeing 737 at 35,000 feet, the real story of Flight 2247 was just beginning. The first flight attendant to reach row 14 was a woman named Sandra Chen, a 15-year United veteran who had worked international long-haul, domestic short-haul, and everything in between, and who had therefore seen a genuinely impressive spectrum of human behavior in pressurized aluminum tubes. She had de-escalated screaming matches over overhead bin space. She had talked a man off an emergency exit door handle somewhere over the Pacific. She had, once, mediated what could only be described as a philosophical dispute between two passengers over the nature of window shade etiquette that had escalated to the verge of physical contact. She had never seen someone destroy another passenger's personal property. "Ma'am," Sandra said, using the specific tone of voice that flight attendants develop over years, calibrated to be firm without adding fuel, professional without being robotic. "Ma'am, I need you to sit down immediately and return that." She looked at the phone, at the spiderweb of cracks across the shattered screen, at the small fragment of screen protector on the tray table. "I need you to return that to the gentleman." "He was recording me," Diane said. "Recording me without my permission. On a plane. That's a federal crime. I want to report a federal crime." "I understand you have a concern," Sandra said, "and we will address it. But right now I need you to sit down. The fasten seatbelt sign is on. I will not sit down until someone explains to me why this man thinks he can film me without my consent." Marcus Webb extended his hand, palm up, across the seatback, toward Diane. "I'll take my phone back now," he said. Quiet, measured, absolute. Something about his stillness, the contrast between his complete composure and Diane's vibrating fury, was more unnerving to the watching cabin than any shouting would have been. Kevin Park in 14C had physically pressed himself against the aisle-side armrest. The woman in 13A had her phone out. Several passengers in the rows ahead and behind had shifted to watch with the particular focused attention of people who know they are witnessing something that will be a story later. "You don't get this back," Diane said to Marcus, and she dropped the broken phone into the seat pocket in front of her. His seat pocket, the one attached to the seat back directly in front of row 14, seat A, and crossed her arms. The cabin went very still. Sandra Chen blinked once. In 15 years of flying, no passenger had ever done that, had taken someone else's destroyed property and placed it in a seat pocket as if claiming it. It was such a specific gesture of dominance, such a deliberate escalation, that for a half-second it simply did not compute. "Ma'am," Sandra said, "that is not your property. You need to remove it from that seat pocket and return it to this passenger immediately." "File a report," Diane said. "File a report on him. File a report on him recording me." "I will be filing a report," Sandra said. "But right now." "Then do it. Do your job." The man in 13B, a retired firefighter from Cincinnati named Don Kowalski, who had been asleep until the scream and who had now been watching the entire exchange with the expression of someone reviewing a workplace safety violation, cleared his throat audibly. "Lady," he said, "give the man his phone." "Mind your business," Diane snapped. "It kind of is my business when you're screaming 6 inches from my head." "You're all witnesses," Diane announced, pivoting to address the cabin as if it were a jury, which in a certain sense it was. "He was recording me. I want this documented. I want every one of you to know that this man was recording me and I defended myself. From 14A, Marcus Webb said, very clearly, to Sandra Chin, "I'd like to speak with the senior flight attendant and the captain, please, at your earliest convenience." He reached forward, recovered his broken phone from the seat pocket with the methodical care of someone collecting evidence, and placed it in his shirt pocket. "And I'd like the in-flight incident reporting form." Sandra Chin had been flying for 15 years. In 15 years, she had heard passengers request the incident reporting form exactly twice, both times lawyers. Something about the way Marcus Webb asked for it, not as a demand, not with any heat, simply as a professional stating a procedural need, made the back of her neck prickle. "Of course," she said, and she walked back toward the galley with the kind of quick, controlled pace that means someone is about to pick up a phone to the flight deck. What happened over the next 40 minutes would be a masterclass in what it looks like when a person who has absolutely no idea what they have done shares a confined pressurized space with the person who knows exactly what they can do about it. Diane Hartwell settled back into 14B with the air of someone who believed they had won a skirmish. She pulled out her own phone and began composing what appeared to be a long complaint message, her thumbs moving fast. She was building her narrative. She had defended herself from being recorded. She had stood up for her rights. The flight attendant had been unhelpful. The airline had failed her again. Marcus Webb in 14A had retrieved a yellow legal pad from his carry-on bag. He had asked Sandra's colleague, a young flight attendant named Tyler, to retrieve it for him from the overhead bin, given the difficulty of rising on a braced leg in a narrow row, and had begun writing. Not furiously, not with the energy of someone venting or drafting a complaint. He wrote with the quiet, organized rhythm of someone building a timeline. Times, specific actions, verbatim quotes he had memorized with the precision of a man trained to remember testimony. The specific language Diane had used about passengers who shouldn't be in regular seating. The exact words she had said about his brace when she first sat down. The moment of the phone grab, the destruction of the phone, the placement of his property in the seat pocket. Kevin Park, who had been watching all of this from 14C with the fascination of someone who suspected they were witnessing something historic, leaned slightly toward Marcus and said quietly, "Dude, is there anything I can do?" Marcus looked at him, smiled, a small, genuine smile. "Were you awake for all of that?" "Every second," Kevin said. "Then you've already done it," Marcus said. He wrote Kevin's name on the legal pad with a question mark. Kevin nodded. Marcus wrote the name down properly. At the forward galley, Sandra Chun was on the flight deck intercom with Captain James Okafor, a 20-year United pilot who ran a tight, professional cockpit and who listened to Sandra's account of row 14 with the focused attention of a man calculating variables. There was a passenger with a mobility disability. There had been discriminatory comments about that disability. There had been physical property destruction. There was an ongoing refusal to comply with crew directives. There was a passenger who had not fastened his seatbelt sign compliant, who had stood in the aisle during active turbulence, who had grabbed and destroyed another passenger's device. Captain Okafor said, "Is the situation contained?" Sandra said, "For now." Captain Okafor said, "Alert me if it changes." And Sandra, "Document everything." "Already am," Sandra said. What Captain Okafor did not know, what Sandra Chin did not know, what Diane Hartwell catastrophically did not know, was that Marcus Webb had been on his phone before Diane destroyed it, and not just recording. He had, in the brief window before the screen shattered, managed to do something that would become one of the most consequential 20-second actions in the history of Flight 2247. He had uploaded the video to cloud storage. Marcus Webb had not practiced aviation law for 23 years without learning to always back up his documentation in real time. The footage, 41 minutes of it, beginning with Diane's first comments about his brace, continuing through the increasingly aggressive behaviors, captured from the slightly downward angle of a phone resting on a legal pad, was sitting on a server in a data center in Virginia. Complete, intact, with a timestamp metadata chain that would stand up in any federal court in the country. Diane Hartwell had smashed a broken phone. The evidence was fine. The turning point came at 12:41 a.m., approximately 1 hour after the initial incident, and it came not from Marcus Webb but from Diane herself, which is the pattern with this particular type of escalation. The person who creates the crisis almost always provides the material for its resolution. Diane had grown restless in the aftermath of her confrontation. The cabin had not returned to normal. It had settled into that particular loaded quiet of a space where people are watching and pretending not to watch, where conversations are being had in low voices, where phones are angled to capture anything that might happen next. She felt correctly that she was being observed. She had the wrong interpretation of why. She had tried to speak to Sandra Chen again when Sandra came through the cabin on a routine check. She had, in a voice she had moderated to something approaching reasonable, said that she wanted to make a formal complaint about the man in 14A. Sandra had said she had noted the concern and that it would be addressed appropriately. Diane had found this unsatisfying. She had then tried to recruit the woman in 13A, a dermatologist from New Jersey named Dr. Patricia Vang who had seen everything, to corroborate her account. Dr. Vang had said, with the serene diplomatic neutrality of a person who has interacted with difficult patients for many years, "I'm not sure I saw it the same way you did." Diane had stared at her for a moment and then turned back around. She had caught Kevin Park looking at her from 14C. She had told him to stop staring. He had looked away, but not before she had noticed that he, like Marcus Webb, had been holding his phone in a position that suggested it might be recording. "Are you filming me?" she said to Kevin Park. Kevin Park, who had a background in computer science and therefore an unusually detailed understanding of both recording laws and personal data rights, said pleasantly, "Illinois is a one-party consent state. We're over Illinois right now." Diane had stared at him. "What does that mean?" Marcus Webb from 14A said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved in a way that a careful observer might have categorized as the ghost of a smile. Diane stood up. This was the moment that flight attendant Tyler, who was standing at the rear galley entrance and watching row 14 the way a wildlife documentary cameraman watches a predator near a watering hole, would later describe as when everything changed. Diane Hartwell, having convinced herself that she was surrounded by people conspiring against her, that the flight attendants were not helping her, that somehow this wheelchair-boarding, brace-wearing man in 14A was the aggressor in a situation she had created. Diane Hartwell reached across Marcus Webb's space, put her hand on Kevin Park's phone and said, "Give me that." Kevin Park did not give her the phone. What Kevin Park did was something that required a specific combination of quick reflexes and the kind of comfort with confrontation you get from having grown up with 3 older brothers. He pulled his phone back, held it above his head out of her reach and said loudly enough for the entire section of the cabin to hear clearly, "Don't touch my phone." Diane grabbed for it again. Her hand hit Kevin's forearm. The sound was not loud, but in the silence of a cabin full of people who were all watching this row, it was very loud. "That's assault," said a voice from 15A. A middle school teacher from Des Moines named Robert Osei, who had not said a word during any of the previous drama, but who had clearly decided that a physical contact moment required him to enter the record. "You just assaulted that man." "I barely touched him," Diane said. "You struck him," Robert Osei said, with the precision of a man who had spent 20 years managing middle schoolers and was therefore extremely well calibrated on the distinction between incidental contact and intentional physical aggression. "I saw it clearly." Marcus Webb pressed the call button. The chime was the beginning of the end. Sandra Chen arrived in 60 seconds. Tyler arrived from the rear galley in 45. And this time, Sandra's voice did not have the quality of someone attempting de-escalation. It had the quality of someone initiating a procedure. "Ma'am, I need you to step back to your seat immediately. You have made physical contact with another passenger. I am informing you that this is a federal offense under 49 U.S. Code Section 46318. A report will be filed with the FAA. You are now required to comply with all crew directives without exception for the remainder of this flight, or this aircraft will divert." The word divert hit the cabin like a pressure change. You could see it, the ripple of reaction moving from row to row as passengers absorbed the information that the plane might land somewhere that was not New York. The man in 16C checked his connecting flight on his phone. The family in row 20 exchanged looks. The retired firefighter Don Kowalski in 13B let out a long breath through his nose. "You're threatening to divert the plane because of me?" Diane said. "Because I touched someone's arm?" I am informing you of the legal framework that applies to this situation, Sandra said. Will you comply with crew directives? Diane sat down. She sat down and she crossed her arms and she stared at the seat back in front of her with the focused intensity of a person who has decided they are being persecuted and is composing the narrative of that persecution in real time. She was going to write a review. She was going to call United Customer Service first thing when she landed. She was going to post about this on every platform she had. This flight attendant, this passenger, this entire airline. She did not understand, could not yet understand, that the universe of consequences she was building in her head was so laughably small compared to what was actually coming that it would have been almost sad if it weren't so richly deserved. In 14A, Marcus Webb had finished the first page of his legal pad and started the second. At 1:08 a.m., Captain James Okafor made a cabin announcement. His voice came through the intercom with the particular quality of authority that a pilot's voice carries in a sealed aircraft. Steady, resonant, impossible to ignore. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Okafor. We are currently cruising at 33,000 feet and are approximately 1 hour and 40 minutes from our destination at Newark Liberty International Airport. I do need to make you aware that we have had a significant passenger incident in the main cabin tonight involving the destruction of property and physical contact between passengers. Our crew has been handling this situation professionally, and I want to thank the vast majority of our passengers for their patience and cooperation. The involved party has been directed to comply with all crew instructions for the remainder of the flight. Aviation law is very clear on the consequences for non-compliance. I will be providing a full report to airline authorities and ground personnel upon landing. We appreciate your patience. The announcement lasted 47 seconds. Felt like a verdict. 2 rows behind Diane, a woman who had watched the entire evening's events unfold, whispered to her husband, "That man is going to prison." Her husband said, "She." The woman said, "Oh, right, she." Diane heard the announcement, heard every word of it, and some circuit of self-preservation that had been offline throughout the preceding hour flickered on, briefly. She thought, "This is getting bigger than I thought." Then she thought, "But I was right. He was recording me. I was defending myself." This is the remarkable cognitive flexibility of the chronic complainer, the ability to reframe any situation, no matter how egregiously of their own making, as a situation in which they are the victim. Diane Hartwell had been practicing this flexibility for decades. It had served her in real estate disputes and restaurant complaints and parking ticket appeals. She did not yet understand that she was in a completely different arena now. She turned to Marcus in 14A. In a voice that had dropped to something approaching a normal conversational register, she said, "You know, I could drop all of this if you just admitted you were recording me." Marcus looked at her over his reading glasses with an expression that was almost scientific in its neutrality. "I was documenting potential violations of the Air Carrier Access Act," he said. "That's not recording. That's evidence collection." Diane blinked. "Air Carrier Access Act? Federal law," Marcus said, "prohibits discrimination against passengers with disabilities by air carriers and by other passengers in ways that affect the air transportation experience." He looked back at his legal pad. "The comments you made about my brace and about passengers, I'm quoting you, who shouldn't be in regular seating are documented. The repeated contact with my personal space is documented. The discriminatory framing of my medical equipment as an inconvenience rather than a medical necessity is documented." He turned a page. "As is everything else." The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds. "You're a lawyer?" Diane said. "I'm an aviation attorney," Marcus said. Specifically, this was, by any measure, a breathtaking moment. The kind of moment that only happens in the contained ecosystem of an airplane cabin. A pressure cooker that has been building since Los Angeles at 33,000 feet in the dead middle of a night flight. Diane Hartwell stared at the man she had spent the past 90 minutes abusing, whose phone she had destroyed, whose personal property she had confiscated and deliberately damaged, who she had described as a person who shouldn't be in regular seating, and for the first time a new calculation was running behind her eyes. "Specifically aviation," she repeated. "For 23 years, Marcus confirmed. Kevin Park in 14C, appeared to have found something extraordinarily interesting to look at on the ceiling of the aircraft. But even then, even in this moment, Diane did not yet understand the full weight of what was descending. She did not know that Marcus Webb had not just practiced aviation law for 23 years. She did not know that he had, for the past 4 years, served as outside litigation counsel for the Department of Transportation's Aviation Consumer Protection Division. She did not know that he was, in fact, on this red-eye tonight because he was flying to New York to present testimony before a Senate subcommittee on Air Carrier Access Act enforcement the following morning. She did not know that among the legal briefs in his overhead carry-on was a draft of proposed regulatory amendments to Part 382 that he had been developing for 18 months. She did not know that he personally knew the names of the attorneys who handled disability discrimination cases at United Airlines legal department, because he had been on opposing counsel in 3 of them. She was about to find out. The revelation came in layers. It came the way legal consequences always come, not all at once, but in a sequence of doors opening, each one revealing a larger room than the last. The first door opened at 1:34 a.m., when Sandra Chun returned to row 14 with a calm, deliberate energy and addressed Marcus directly. "Mr. Webb," she said. She had been given his name from the passenger manifest, which she had pulled after his first request for the incident form. "We have reached the airline's senior duty officer by air-to-ground communication. Given the nature of the incident, including the destruction of personal property and the physical contact with another passenger, the duty officer has requested your account of events and has authorized me to inform the party in 14B that federal law enforcement will be meeting this aircraft at Newark." The words "federal law enforcement" performed an immediate and visible effect on Diane Hartwell. The color changed in her face. A very specific change, from the flushed pink of sustained agitation to something considerably more pale. "Federal law enforcement," she said. "Air marshals will escort you from the aircraft," Sandra said, and now she was speaking to Diane directly, in the same professional tone, but with nothing in it designed to soften the information. "You will be interviewed by Port Authority and FAA representatives. The airline will be cooperating fully." "This is insane," Diane said. "I didn't do anything." "You destroyed a passenger's personal property," Sandra said. "You made physical contact with another passenger. You failed to comply with crew safety directives on multiple occasions." "He was recording me." "Mr. Webb," Sandra said, turning to Marcus with a question implicit in her tone. Marcus reached into his shirt pocket and produced the broken phone. "I was recording a potential Air Carrier Access Act violation," he said. "I have 23 years of experience in aviation law, and I am authorized under DOT guidance to document disability discrimination incidents. Additionally, the footage was uploaded to cloud storage prior to the damage to this device." He set the phone on the tray table. "I'll need a bag to preserve this as evidence, please." Sandra Chin said, "Of course," and left. The second door, the man in 13B, retired firefighter Don Kowalski, leaned forward over the seat back and said to no one in particular, "He uploaded it first. The video." He laughed. A short, quiet, appreciative laugh. "Man, Kevin Park, in 14C, said to Marcus, 'Can I give you my contact information?' Marcus said yes and tore the bottom corner off his legal pad, and Kevin wrote down his phone number with the energy of someone who understood they were signing up for something historic. The third door, and this was the door that truly changed the trajectory of the remainder of the flight, opened when Diane Hartwell made her final mistake. Perhaps it was panic. Perhaps it was the same instinct that had driven every escalation of the evening. The instinct that more pressure, more volume, more assertion of victimhood would somehow turn the tide. She unbuckled her seatbelt. She stood up. She pointed at Marcus Webb and she announced, in a voice that carried clearly to at least 15 rows in every direction, "This man has been harassing me this entire flight. He deliberately put his broken leg equipment into my space to make me uncomfortable. He recorded me without my consent. And this airline is victimizing me. A paying customer who has been with United for 15 years, to protect him." She was still talking when the two figures in plain clothes who had been seated in rows 22C and 22D, who had been watching the situation for the past hour with the practiced stillness of people trained to observe without being observed, stood up and moved through the aisle toward row 14 with the unhurried, absolute authority of federal officers who have made this walk many times before. Air Marshal Daniel Torres and Air Marshal Claire Nguyen had been assigned to Flight 2247 as a routine deployment. They had watched the events of the evening via cabin observation and had been in contact with the flight deck twice. When Captain Okafor had made his announcement, it had been in part because Torres had advised him to. The formal announcement put a behavioral marker in the record. "Ma'am," Air Marshal Torres said, arriving at row 14 with his credentials in hand. "Federal Air Marshal Service. Please sit down." Diane Hartwell looked at the credentials. Her mouth opened and then closed. "Sit down," Claire Nguyen said. She sat down. The cabin was utterly silent. 286 people who had all been pretending to be asleep or disinterested were no longer pretending anything. Marcus Webb looked at Air Marshal Torres and said, calmly, "I'd like to provide a formal statement. I also have a medical and professional disclosure." Torres said, "Go ahead." "I'm Marcus Delano Webb. I'm an aviation attorney with 23 years of practice in federal aviation law. I currently serve as outside litigation counsel to the DOT's Aviation Consumer Protection Division. I am traveling to Newark to present Senate testimony on Air Carrier Access Act enforcement." He held out the broken phone. This device was grabbed from my hand and deliberately destroyed by the passenger in 14B. The recording on it had already been uploaded. Additionally, the passenger in 14C and several others witnessed the full sequence of events, including discriminatory statements made about my mobility disability. Torres looked at the phone, looked at Diane Hartwell, looked at Marcus, said, "We'll need your full statement on the ground." "Of course," Marcus said. "I've also been taking contemporaneous notes." He held up the legal pad. 2 pages so far. Something happened then. Something that you very rarely see in any professional context, let alone in the middle of an airplane aisle at 33,000 feet. Air Marshal Torres, a 15-year veteran of the Federal Air Marshal Service who had been trained to maintain absolute neutrality of expression in all situations, allowed the corner of his mouth to move in what could most generously be described as a gesture of involuntary respect. The cabin was still completely silent. Then, from somewhere in the rows behind row 14, someone began to clap. Slow, deliberate, a single pair of hands, and then another pair, and then, in the way that only happens when an entire confined space has been collectively holding its breath and finally gets permission to exhale, the sound built. Not a roaring standing ovation. The ceiling was too low for that, the stakes too serious. But something real. Something that rolled through the cabin of Flight 2247 like a pressure wave, row by row, from the back to the front, 200 and more passengers registering what they had witnessed and giving it the only response that felt honest. Diane Hartwell stared at her seat back. She did not look up for the rest of the flight. Flight 2247 touched down at Newark Liberty International Airport at 2:54 a.m. It had landed 7 minutes early. Captain Okafor had pushed the throttle slightly on approach, because he had been informed that federal personnel were meeting the aircraft and he preferred an efficient resolution. The wheels kissed the runway at runway 22R with a bump and a screech that woke the last few passengers still asleep, and the engines roared into reverse thrust with the particular sound of a machine designed to halt momentum. Before a single seatbelt was unbuckled, before the boarding bridge was even attached to the jetway door, the captain came on the intercom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Newark Liberty International. Local time is 2:54 a.m. Temperature outside is 61 degrees. We will be remaining seated until Port Authority officers and federal representatives have completed their business in the main cabin. We appreciate your continued patience and we apologize sincerely for the events of this evening. Most specifically, on behalf of United Airlines, I want to personally apologize to Mr. Marcus Webb in seat 14A. You handled tonight with extraordinary grace." Diane Hartwell heard every word. What happened on the jetway and in the terminal took approximately 90 minutes of processing time but can be described with some efficiency. Port Authority police met the aircraft at the door. Air Marshals Torres and Nguyen escorted Diane Hartwell from her seat. She walked under her own power, quietly, the performance of the previous 2 hours entirely absent from her expression. which had settled into something much simpler and much less confident. The expression of a person who is beginning to understand the actual size of what they have done. A Port Authority officer took her into a secure room adjacent to Gate C-94. Marcus Webb was offered a wheelchair for deplaning. He accepted it without embarrassment. It was a reasonable accommodation that would have been appropriate from the beginning, as he had requested when he originally checked in and been told none were available at the gate level. He deplaned third, behind the air marshals, and was met at the jetway by United Airlines regional vice president named Sandra Okonkwo, who happened to be in the terminal that night for a separate matter, and had been called in when the duty officer communicated the full profile of the incident. She introduced herself. She apologized. She apologized again. Marcus shook her hand pleasantly and said he'd be following up through appropriate channels. He gave his full statement to Port Authority and FAA representatives over the next hour. He provided cloud storage access to the video. He provided his legal pad notes. He provided Kevin Park as a witness. Kevin had given his statement voluntarily, still wide-eyed with the energy of someone who had not slept a single minute of the red eye and didn't mind. He provided Dr. Patricia Vang from 13A, who had in fact been taking her own contemporaneous notes on her phone, because she was a doctor, and documenting things was her professional instinct too. He provided Robert Osei from 15A, who described the physical contact between Diane and Kevin Park with the precise vocabulary of a man who has spent 20 years distinguishing between accidents and intentional actions for school administrators. In the secure room at Gate C-94, Diane Hartwell was informed of the following in sequence, by a Port Authority officer reading from a prepared list with the patience of someone who had done this before. The destruction of another passenger's personal property on board an aircraft was addressed under federal statutes governing conduct aboard aircraft. The physical contact with Kevin Park in 14C constituted actionable assault under 49 U.S. Code Section 46318. The statements she had made about Marcus Webb's disability device created exposure under the Air Carrier Access Act and DOT Part 382. The recording she had herself been doing of Marcus Webb, which she had cited as her justification for destroying his phone, had been done with her own consent as the recorder. The legal framework she had invoked did not apply to her own situation in the way she had claimed. United Airlines was placing an indefinite hold on her MileagePlus account pending the completion of the federal review. The FAA was opening a passenger misconduct file. She was not arrested that night. The Port Authority had discretion on this, and the federal representatives chose to proceed through citation and mandatory interview processes rather than immediate detention. But she was detained for processing until 5:15 a.m. Her connecting flight, she had, ironically, been booked on a 6 a.m. United connection to Scottsdale, was missed. United did not rebook her. Her name entered the Federal Civil Aviation Incident Database. In the weeks and months that followed, the story of Flight 2247 spread through aviation industry channels with the particular velocity of a story that contains every element the industry finds simultaneously cautionary and satisfying. Marcus Webb's Senate testimony, which he delivered the following afternoon, rested and precisely on time, included a first-hand account of the previous night's incident as a case study in disability discrimination enforcement gaps and the need for strengthened Air Carrier Access Act passenger protections. He noted, with what the Senate subcommittee later described as remarkable composure given the circumstances, that he had been the victim of precisely the kind of incident his testimony was designed to prevent, less than 12 hours before delivering that testimony. United Airlines reached a private resolution with Marcus Webb that was described in airline industry reporting as substantial and included a formal written apology from the airline's CEO, a comprehensive review of disability accommodation protocols at Los Angeles International Airport, where his initial wheelchair request had not been fulfilled, and a donation to the National Disability Rights Network made in his name. Diane Hartwell faced FAA civil penalties. She faced a civil lawsuit from Marcus Webb for the destruction of personal property, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violations of the Air Carrier Access Act. She faced a civil claim from Kevin Park for the assault. The federal review process moved with the particular momentum of a system that takes property destruction aboard aircraft seriously, and especially seriously when the property was destroyed in a context of documented disability discrimination. United Airlines placed her on its internal do not fly list pending resolution of the federal proceedings. She was joined there, in the FAA passenger misconduct database, by a growing list of co-travelers who had believed that the sealed environment of an airplane was a consequence-free space for the worst versions of themselves. Her local Scottsdale real estate practice suffered the consequence that such incidents now reliably suffer in the age of connected witnesses. The story reached social media through Kevin Park's account of events, shared first as a late-night Twitter thread that went to 60,000 likes before he was even off the escalator at baggage claim, expanded through aviation forums and disability rights organizations and legal commentary channels, and arrived in local Scottsdale news within 48 hours. The Luxury Home Staging podcast, with its 4,000 listeners, temporarily gained several 100,000 new listeners who had come to hear something very different from interior design content. None of this made Marcus Webb's phone undestroyed. None of it gave him back the 2 hours of a red-eye flight that should have been spent sleeping before a Senate appearance. None of it changed the experience of sitting in seat 14A with a leg brace and a legal pad, while a stranger said things about whether he belonged in regular seating. But here is what Marcus Webb said when a reporter from an aviation industry publication asked him how he felt about the outcome of the Flight 2247 incident and its aftermath. He said, "People with disabilities travel. We travel constantly. We travel for work, for family, for the same reasons everyone travels. We have the same right to board a plane, sit in a seat, and arrive at our destination without being told, explicitly or through behavior, that our presence is an imposition. The Air Carrier Access Act exists because Congress understood this. The enforcement of that law exists because some people need to learn it in contexts where the consequences are real." He paused. "I happen to be in a position to make the consequences real. Most people in that situation are not. That's what needs to change." The Senate subcommittee incorporated his testimony, including the Flight 2247 case study, into its final report on aviation accessibility enforcement. 2 specific amendments to DOT Part 382, relating to passenger disability harassment and the documentation rights of passengers experiencing discrimination, were adopted into proposed regulatory language that entered the federal rulemaking process 6 months later. Sandra Chun received a commendation from United Airlines for her handling of the incident. Captain James Okafor received one as well. Tyler, the flight attendant who had retrieved Marcus's legal pad from the overhead bin, was later asked in an internal airline debrief what had made him think to do that. He said, "He asked calmly, and I thought, this man is going to need to write things down. I didn't know exactly why, but I knew." Kevin Park's Twitter thread, with screenshots of Diane Hartwell's behavior corroborated by multiple other passengers who reached out after the story broke, became one of the most widely shared disability rights accounts of that year. He was invited to speak on a podcast about bystander intervention. He declined, saying he hadn't really done anything special. He had just held onto his phone. Don Kowalski, the retired firefighter in 13B, was asked by his daughter what the craziest thing that had ever happened to him was. He thought about it. 30 years of firefighting, plane rides, a life full of events. And he said, "This one's up there." He did not elaborate. He felt the story belonged to Marcus Webb. And Marcus Webb went home, eventually, after the testimony and the Port Authority process and the airline meeting and 2 days of follow-up calls with DOT colleagues. And he sat in his living room in Silver Spring, Maryland, with a cup of coffee, and he looked at his phone. His new phone, the replacement already set up and signed in. The cloud storage still there, the footage intact, everything backed up the way it always was. He had one final thought, which he did not share publicly but which anyone who knew him would have recognized as characteristic. He thought that the most important thing he had done that night, in seat 14A of Flight 2247 over the darkened American Midwest, was not the legal knowledge, not the Senate testimony waiting in New York, not the 23 years of aviation law. The most important thing he had done was stay calm. Because calm, in a pressurized aluminum tube with nowhere to go, is the most powerful thing a person can be. Every airplane is a closed system. What you bring into it, your patience, your respect, your ability to recognize that the 285 other people around you are also human beings with their own braces and briefcases and reasons for being somewhere, is exactly what you're going to be sitting inside of for the duration of the flight. There is no escape at 35,000 feet. The only question is what you choose to carry. Marcus Webb chose carefully. He always had. And somewhere in Scottsdale, Arizona, Diane Hartwell was learning, late, expensively, publicly, the same lesson that every flight attendant brief, every FAA regulation, Every moment of basic human decency had been trying to teach her all along. The sky is not yours. It belongs to everyone. If this story made you think about your last flight differently, share it. Because somewhere on a plane right now, there is a person with a brace, a cane, a crutch, a wheelchair who deserves exactly the same sky as everyone else. Make sure they get it. And stay with this channel because the next story coming your way involves a business class passenger, a flight attendant she tried to get fired, and a twist at 30,000 feet that nobody saw coming.